Hey, Stefan.
Hello, hello.
All right, we're going to give everyone a couple minutes as we normally do, so we'll get
Yep.
started.
Good morning, everyone. Team, I'll do what you asked Jen to do. I can do that. So I'll update the meeting invite with the proper link.
Oh, you got the power now. Huh? All right.
Yeah, no, don't say too much, but I can do that.
I appreciate it. It makes it easier if someone else don't come up
Yeah,
with it.
no, of course. Okay, it's done now.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, you're welcome.
A little late today, well, we can get started. Others can join coming in. So, um, this is the March 27th ORAN uh, meeting. We've got really only a couple things that were scheduled to do today. One is to approve the previous minutes, and then the second is to talk a little bit more about the two user stories that have been a a asked for further design discussion in this session or in this working hour. The first one is on the Craig cluster, and I saw that there was some design documentation put in place. And then there's the cluster registration that came back that isn't necessarily ORAN related, but the ORAN Craig cluster and the cluster registration, as well as the OCloud registration, kind of all will need to work together on it. With that, does anyone else have anything else to discuss? Hearing nothing, I'm asking if there's here's the minutes that we recorded from the 20th of March meeting. Does anyone have any issues approving this meeting minutes? Okay. See any? We're approved. Okay, so we're going to get started. Again, I think Stefan, I think this is your show at this point that you can talk to them about the presentation that you put together that gives a better example of what you've documented in the cluster use case. So if you want to start sharing, that'd be great.
Yeah, I will do that. Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Got to pick. Yep, we do now.
So
Yeah.
I can jump straight into it then, because in the last meeting we talked about now then taking the next step into being more specific related to the O2 AMS, if you say a pre-standard O2 AMS interface, and how this would then be realized by the, actually what I looked into, both the IMS side and the OCloud side, and how you do like a server side logic then for this O2 AMS interface. Then I have looked into some alternatives now then for the FOCOM side. So what we talked about briefly last week was that we should have an O2IMS provisioning interface that is KRM CRD based, where we then have a custom resource we use then in order to trigger cluster creation. I took a look at your technical report, Alexis, from ORAN, and we had that discussion then, and I align it a bit to what we have talked in this meeting also. So my suggestion then is that we have this kind of a cluster claim CR, that is the one basically you apply or post then on the API then. I have just naming is always something we can discuss, right? But basically, I thought it could be good to have something indicating that this is like a pre-AutoIMS resource. Still keeping it in the nephew org path, because it's not ORAN yet. And then you just call it cluster claim. And then I think that so far, my thinking was that we should have a reference here then to the OCloud name. The way I understood it also in ORAN is that you represent, like you have a representation of the OCloud in the SMO, the way the SMO sees the OCloud, and that is the name I'm referring to here then, the way the SMO have identified this OCloud. And then you have a OCloud cluster template, you have a target site, and then you have any other instance specific input data. That is like a key value structure here in my suggestion. So I thought that would basically be the thing you need to then send over. I don't know if you have any immediate comment on that. No, I was not able to upload this until today, so you have not had any much time to look at it, I know. But in terms of the data being sent, that is what I thought for now, at least, what we should consider. And then you would need to have an OTIMS operator here then acting on this custom resource, the cluster claim custom resource. And here I thought that basically what this one would do then essentially to start with is that it triggers a port cloning of the referred OCloud cluster template into the package or into the management repo. And it applies this input data then, so that that is then conveyed as instance specific data then into this package deployment. And the way you transfer this data then, that we had that up in the previous meetings. We had this aligned kind of information then. So you have the OTIMS data on both sides and inside of the workload cluster custom resource. So as a part of you deploying this package, you would need to provide the input data then for the workload cluster, where basically this information is then carried.
Okay, hey, Stefan, just real quick, just before we move on with that, Alexis has his hand up.
Yeah.
First, thanks, Stefan. I think this is we're getting closer and closer every day, so thank you. Couple of comments. API version, in Kubernetes, the V1 Alpha 1 indicates that it is not necessarily a mature API. So I would not have a prefix in the API version. I would just leave V1 Alpha 1, and when the standard is there, we can call it V1 or V whatever that is in line with the standard.
Yeah.
That's the second is I'm gonna go with the easiest one. OCloud cluster template ID. I was hoping that, in general statement, I don't understand why we need OCloud as a prefix to all the parameters, given we're already under the O2IMS kind of sub tree in the YAML. That's the first kind of, the easier it is to read, the better. And repeating OCloud when it's under O2IMS seems to just add words. So that's one comment. I don't know if you're attached to that OCloud prefix, but I would else recommend to just remove it. It depends. But then the cluster template ID, I think we said we don't want to call this an ID, but a reference, because that can be anything. In Red Hat, it might be a Git repository. In Ericsson, it might be a well, I don't know, something else. In Wind River, it might be something else. So ID is a bit restrictive. Ref is less restrictive. So, from a convention standpoint, I also mentioned this is the preferred way in Nefio. So I would like to hopefully stick with that. And then OCloud. So I'm a bit puzzled about the OCloud name in SMO field in there. What value does it bring when I'm into the IMS? I'm not sure about that specific field. The cluster template input, I think I don't have any issue.
Which one? The site?
The first one.
No, the first one, the OCloud name in SMO. So that one, it feels weird because
that links both of them. He's got to kind of know what the SMO is going to do. He's got to correlate that which cloud you're talking about. But I guess you're saying it's already cloud one. You already know which O cloud it is. An IMS can only go to one O cloud. So
exactly.
you'd already know what your cloud is.
You are yourself. Okay, I can take it away. I wasn't sure myself. Because I mean you have it up on the Focom side, so I wasn't sure whether you should inform the OCloud. I've been looking into this, like there is a bit of an uncertainty there in this ORAN cluster registration use cases. I mean, who is registering towards who, and who is aware of I mean, at least, okay, the ID is owned, I understand, by the SMO. That is where you have like a reference to an OCloud. Actually, I can take it away. I didn't have any strong thoughts about why it should be there. It was more of, I just kept it looking the same then. So.
Okay, and so then I would just make consistent the OCloud cluster template ID and OCloud site. I will have both said OCloud cluster template ref and OCloud site ref. Because then it allows the implementer to reference the way they want. If they want to reference with an ID, they can. If they reference with a URL, they can. You see where I'm going? So that way we're not providing restriction on how that reference needs to be.
But in reality, a ref is kind of a string, or?
A ref is a string, but the string for Red Hat can be a URL. So when I receive the request, it's a URL. I know it's a URL. When Wind River received the string, they know it's an enum. So where I'm going with this is if it's an ID, then it's an ID, right? It's an identifier is usually a UUID, and it's very, very defined. Whereas a reference is whatever the implementer wants to use as a reference, and they will know because this is them implementing. From a Focom SMO standpoint, it doesn't matter because you're not implementing. You just want to tell the IMS that's the cluster template I want you to deploy or to instantiate. So, and same goes with the OCloud site. Before you used to have OCloud site ID, you dropped the ID, but I think we need consistency in the way we are referring to these things. And so my preference, that's my opinion, I'm open to others, but would be to have them call the ref as Kubernetes does, as we do in the VLAN claim and the VLAN IP pool. All of that is using reference to specific entities. So that's my preferred option.
If you compare, because here you said we could drop the prefix then, or this OCloud, basically, because I can understand that this is the IMS interface. So here, whatever you transport, whatever you send on that CR then is referring to like entities in OCloud. What about if I say the suggestions here in the workload cluster CR in order to carry this? I mean, this is more of the templates as I see it, and that you have a package on the OCloud side that you are referring to, and here you have this template ref is whatever that is, then URI or something. That is what also should then be exposed, so you can carry it over and have it also on the in the workload cluster then on the SMO side. Should we drop OCloud here also then? Because I have it all over here. So we put it under or?
That's a suggestion. I think the shorter the variables are, the easier they are to digest. Now, all of that will be done programmatically, so maybe we don't care. But if my opinion is yes, I'd like to have them removed. But it's, again, just my opinion.
I would agree with you. Like O2 IMS, I mean, you're dealing with OCloud. So unless you're not dealing with within the O2 IMS, OCloud is everything. So you might have another resource, a node but even then, it's still all OCloud. O2 IMS never deals with anything that's not OCloud, right?
That's what I think.
Yeah, perhaps because.
But look, that's not a big deal. So
at
that's
this
not
point,
a big deal.
Okay. So at least the first OCloud name. I mean, here on the SMO side, here I somehow would need to provide this and carry in this OCloud name as input.
Yeah, but I would have just said it with I just would have said it with the OCloud name, right?
Yeah,
but that was fine. But we're saying get rid of that because you don't need it
for
right?
the others. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, again, I would argue even in SMO, because right now it's weird to have. So how it's I'm trying to depict. So from a FOCOM standpoint, I'm trying to change my gears a bit. From a FOCOM standpoint, what you want to say is you're targeting the O2 IMS of a specific OCloud. Yeah, yeah, exactly. But then again, OCloud name, I wouldn't have OCloud name as we're doing with cluster template, as we're doing with site. I would have OCloud ref.
Yeah.
And as a FOCOM implementation, the ref can be a name, the ref can be whatever. Again, to try to bring consistency in how we're building our models.
Okay.
But it means the exact same thing. It's more about modeling consistency here.
I see your point. Yeah. So it will be OCloud ref, site ref, cluster template ref.
That's my preference. And I think the cluster template input, that's fine. I mean, that property bag with key value. Although you'll have more questions on that down the road. For now, I think it's good enough. Yeah, that's all the comments on that one. Sorry, on the previous slides.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. That's good.
But we're good.
Anything else?
Make sure.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that we're okay with the processing here. We have an O2 IMS operator, we have a porch operator, and the process that he's kind of showing in this diagram. Does anyone have any concerns or objection about that? Okay.
No, hang on.
Right.
You're right. I didn't look into that one.
All right. Want to make sure.
So when SMO sends that request to IMS, what can you explain, like these arrows, like what's can you tell me, what's the flow, like 1, 2, 3, 4? I don't, there are 5 arrows. What happens?
So you would apply this CR, then the cluster claim CR, and that, I mean, the CRD then is for this cluster claim CR is served by the O2IMS operator. So that is the one that will try to reconcile this cluster claim CR. This cluster claim CR has the cluster template ref then. that should be like in this case. Then, if we say in the nephew case, I would say that is like the name, not a revision ID, but just the generic name for a particular cluster template in this OCloud cluster template repo. So that one should be possible to find. So when you do a porch clone here, you send a clone request for this template in order to then deploy a new cluster instance then in the management repo. So, and that is, I would say, that is done via the Porch API then, okay? I draw it just as an arrow. I mean, that will go back then to the
I
Kubernetes
understood.
API input, yeah. But basically, you refer to this template with this ref name. And the target is this the name here then. I would say the same as I was thinking, that basically the cluster claim will have the same name as you want to have for your cluster package deployment.
Yeah,
So
that
cluster
it's
one,
clear. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the quick explanation. I think I got it. Yeah, I'm fine. I lower
So
my hand.
Robbie, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, a quick questions. I mean, when you say porch operator, you're talking about the regular porch, right? I mean, you put it inside the IMS. Is that something? Did you mean something else with porch operator there?
No, it's just a regular. I don't see that we need to do any changes there in that one. So that would basically just be a standard package deployment, just the way it looks like today in Nephew.
Okay, no, okay, because you put it all under IMS.
So basically, the way I see it is that I could clarify that this is the IMS one here is an OCloud IMS implemented based on Nephew. So this is basically you have the Nephew. Everything here would be then a Nephew deployment and realizing the IMS.
Oh, I see. It's specific to the OCloud kind of a context. I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I say Vish, you now have your hand raised?
Yeah, I do. Just a very basic question. Sorry, I joined a couple of minutes late. When we say the proposal in ORAN is to make the O2MS provisioning interface KRM CRD based, so whether the underlying whether it is a Kubernetes cluster or whether it is an OpenStack VM, environment, are we saying that we're going to be always using KRM CRD based, or is this very specific to when we are talking in the context of Kubernetes?
So, in my view, I saw it like, yeah, it's the focus is that it is KRM CRD based, and you are following this API approach, then, like the Kubernetes API approach.
Okay, so I mean,
I would expect it from Fucom side, yeah.
Okay, because I can still see we can still be KRM based, and still we can actually go interface with OpenStack cluster also. There is possibility, but I just wanted to understand whether there was some scope, like saying that this proposal is limited to only on K8s cluster and nothing to do with VMs. So that's what I was trying to see if there were any assumptions made there.
Can I ask you how do you relate it to a VM? Could you?
Because I mean, I know the theory that you can also actually bring up VMs instead of a Kubernetes cluster, right? Today, you can spin up a VM inside a container, right? And then I know that there are existing deployments out there that will still be like, for some time, which will be container based and also VM based. And I'm only trying to understand if this approach is very unified across all this, or if it is like in the context of a Kubernetes and only, and then I can still see the modeling aspects. At least theoretically, I can think about that. Yeah, we could always specify some of these things in KRM based, and it will be the SMO or somebody that will probably understand where it needs to be deployed. There'll be an adapter that will probably be invoked to go deploy it on OpenStack if it needs to be a VM and stuff like that.
So when you say spin up a VM, you mean basically that you Fucom would use the IMS in order to actually order creation of a VM instead of creation of a cluster? Or was it more that the IMS itself would be implemented with a VM rather than a cluster?
So FOCOM is equivalent of NFVO, right? And it's
yeah. FOCOM is the SMO part, yeah, like the cluster or infrastructure manager, we can say.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the details about. I haven't spent too much time. I'm coming up to speed on ORAN in general, but I'm always thinking about whether I know we have something called as a K8 spec, right? In a Kubernetes spec that is being that Alexei had been presenting earlier. I'm always really trying to understand what the scope covers, basically. You know, hey, whether the context is always Kubernetes when we talk about some of these things, or whether it seems to be covering across. That is what I'm trying to come up to understand.
So in one aspect, the way I see it, and in terms of the resources you are aiming to deploy in ORAN, I mean, they have the ambition, like for infrastructure management or the infrastructure management services, they should be able there to do deployment of they call them node clusters. That could either be an OpenStack VM you are deploying with a number of compute servers, or it is a Kubernetes cluster then with a number of worker nodes. So yeah, their ambition level is that the IMS and the OCloud should be able to support like infrastructure management of both IaaS deployments like OpenStack and the Kubernetes cluster deployments. And I see that we should have the same O2IMS interface as such for both types, and irrespectively of what you are aiming to deploy on your sites. You should still have the same O2IMS API. The way I would see that it differs then a lot is these cluster templates then. So that if you want to deploy an OpenStack VM, your cluster template then will be completely different. And also your underlying infrastructure on the IMS side and will have some logic then to support spinning up a new OpenStack VM and allocating the computes for that one then. But I will say that the input data then, I think this is perhaps something we should give some thoughts about, but essentially the input data should still be that you are referring to a template then, either for starting a cluster or starting an OpenStack VM, and you tell the site is basically the place where you have the hardware for supporting this, right? And then you have the input data, and that will be also again then quite different than depending on what it is you are actually spinning up then. But then the aim should be that the API as such, that should be the same then. And here the thinking is that if we have a KRM CRD based API, is basically just that API is enabling you to send down this CRD or CR resource then into the IMS, and then the IMS will have the operator logic then to proceed then with the next steps after that.
Okay. Yeah, because I see the title of the slide is NFVO pre-standard, so I know it's in the context of Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah.
But then I also see that in ORAN is agnostic of all these things. That is why I was trying to get things clarified. So
yeah, so I agree, and I think I mean from an ORAN perspective, if we would promote this as a like long-term node and as something evolving into the interface for ORAN, I think it should still work. It should still work to have like a CRD based interface here, where you then basically send down that as a custom resource, then the thing you would like to deploy, and there you refer to the relevant template.
Okay, thank you.
Then another thing we have discussed internally in Ericsson is like related to the actual exposure here. Then I mean, what we could say in an IMS NFVO implementation is that we could always just start with exposing the Kubernetes API of this the NFVO management cluster in order to implement this IMS. If we say we realize it in NFVO, then what we probably would need to consider is that we should have a way of having some sort of an authentication proxy layer on top. we need to discuss what that would be then. If we should have some more proper RBAC authentication based support, not necessarily just using the Kubernetes authentication. And I know this has been discussed also for the Porch API. I think there is in the security working group, there is some work on this. I was thinking that probably we could start with just having just the Kubernetes API, and then we could involve the security working group to see, okay, if we should have some more advanced authentication proxy as a front end, as an alternative.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I would agree.
Yeah, okay, good. Next step then, just thinking about what will happen here then. So the way I saw it, that once you have then created this cluster one workload package here, then this package deployment in the cluster management repo, then the workflow will be very much look like it does today then in like when you in R1, R2, then when you deploy a cluster, you have this package variant CRs in the cluster package. They will in themselves be created as CRs, and they will then clone the underlying example packages. Here I have something I call an cluster IMS internal cluster package variant. I mean, in the current demo, you have this cluster copy kind package variant that is creating a package for the copy kind deployment. Here I was thinking that, yeah, here you have something probably completely, you could have something completely IMS internal as a custom resource that is like handled by an internal operator or whatever. It all depends on how you would like to model this on the IMS side. So I have not really gone into the detail of that part here then. I saw that the most important part is that we have the thinking around how this O2IMS operator will work, because the other part is more like, yeah, that is something you need to solve anyway in FU, how you're handling your vendor-specific way of working then once you have this cluster package deployment and the package variants then triggered. What I think you need to have, you have the workload cluster CR there. That one should be there the way it always works in FU. I also think you should have these resources that are in the management staging repo. They should be created here on the IMS side. Because these are these cluster global resources, like the config sync deployment and those resources that shall be, they shall go into the workload cluster, but they are more these global or infrastructure, I would say, related things that should always be there when you are deploying your cluster. So my thinking was that they should be handled here as a part of the IMS work then, and not up on the SMO FOCOM side.
Hold it. So Alexis, you had something to add to this?
Yeah, first of all is what you depicted on the right here is pretty much the way things are working when it comes to IP claim, VLAN claim. The idea is that the claim becomes what, maybe in your case where we can supply the secret name, I might argue, but the bottom CR, like the cluster, where you have API version IMS internal, I mean, I would have the same API version of the cluster claim. That's my first comment, but there is definitely a place for that second CR at the bottom that might be internal. And the reality is this is what will get into the inventory of the IMS ultimately, because this is where all the low-level details of what is in the cluster, all the various components of bare metal components and components of these bare metal servers and so on, all of that is going to be bubbled up from that cluster creation, not from that just instance, but from the overall cluster creation.
Yes.
And I foresee this as being probably one of the component of the IAM for the inventory piece. At least that's how I'm picturing it right now, and that's how we've been dealing with the other kind of resources within Nefio and how we deal with them. So that's absolutely aligned with implementation elsewhere in Nefio, and I think this is good. And the more interaction on the various, cluster template repo, management repo, and management staging, I think is fine as well, right? I think this is okay. I don't have any objections. So basically, I just talk to say thumbs up. I agree with this. Thank you.
All right. So if I understand this correctly, then we're saying, does anyone have any concerns about the different artifacts that have been created and the placement of those artifacts? Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Cool.
So then I agree on that there will be a lot of other resources. There must be some way for this OTIMS operator, as I see it, then, to judge via like the status conditions of these resources. So judge, okay, when is this workload cluster actually up and running? And as I see it, then that would be even then once you have successfully deployed these management staging resources also then into that new workload cluster. And at that time, this O2IMS operator then should say that, okay, this cluster claim status then is ready, then. Not before that, as I see it. Because this will basically tell the SMO that, yeah, now you can go ahead and start deploying your network functions into this cluster. It's completely up and running and ready to take those.
Well, be careful,
yeah.
Right? So
yeah.
You got a claim, right, that says I've created this stuff. Now, the stuff that I created, right, may not be healthy. So what's the difference between a claim being ready and a cluster being healthy? So can I have a claim that is ready that a cluster is unhealthy? I think that's what you meant, right?
Yeah. Could you have that? I mean, in that case, because this is something we have discussed also in ourselves in our like different COP implementations or proof of concepts we have done so far. I mean, should you still, even in this case, you have an IMS here, should you not assume that the IMS can guarantee you that, okay, the cluster is actually ready and up and running and completely, should you have some checks from FOCOM directly towards the cluster? You do some additional queries that you can at least, you can access the cluster via its credentials and so on. I mean,
well, but there's a difference between, or at least in my view, there's a difference between the claim being I've allocated these resources to the cluster, right? Everything's all allocated. It's just not healthy at the moment, right? And so there's a status of the cluster that's individual from the status of the claim, right? At least in my view. But Robbie and Alexis have their hands up.
A quick question on this cluster management repo and management staging repos. Are these kind of upstream repo for the cluster you're creating? I mean, in the arrows, so first question, okay, so you have the cluster claim. I'm assuming that the cluster claim is basically being processed by the O2IMS operator, and it generates something like the cluster CR, and the cluster CR includes it has a reference to the IMS. It basically creates another package that includes all the KRM resources for actually creating the cluster, and there is something else.
Yeah. So actually, the role of the OTIMS operator in this slide is much less than. So I almost should have had a slide in between, because basically what I see is that the OTIMS operator essentially it does this port cloning then of the cluster package deployment. Then there is a whole lot of things that are done here then by the current standard existing NEFIO mechanisms. This cluster package deployment, the way it already works today, that is the one that triggers off that all these package variants are cloned into the staging repo. And this IMS internal cluster package variant is also cloned in here. And then once they are cloned, they will then in turn create, the resources that they are, using. Like for instance, this IMS internal cluster package variant, that is the one that would actually create this and deploy the package and create this custom resource then. So and all that thing is just handled via config sync then, the way it normally is done in NEFIO. And then once you have that config sync done, then I would expect you have other IMS internal operators, like if you are using copy, for instance, under the hood in your IMS, you would have a copy operator that is acting on those manifest files. If you have something else like the Red Hat ACM site config templates, you have Argo CD there cloning those into custom resources, and you have ACM taking actions based on those. All that, I haven't drawn that. Essentially, what I see is that eventually you would, once you are kind of done, then you have like this zero-touch provisioning done or something. That is like implementation specific. This AutoIMS operator then would need to just monitor those resources that are relevant to be able to communicate that the IMS side has basically finished. The cluster is deployed and considered up and running. And then that would update this cluster claim CR then and put the condition here to ready.
Okay. So yeah, so there are other controllers, the CAPI controller or
exactly,
equivalent
yeah.
ones that is missing there.
Yeah.
Okay. It's not shown there. Okay, got it.
More
Okay.
clear, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That would be nice. If you just put a dotted circle and show that, okay, once you start hydrating or after the specialization, then the config sync, commits those packages, and then you have some other controllers acting on that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I shall do that. Yeah.
My comment was related to Tim's comment. I didn't want to go there initially, but now I will. So, like I mentioned, the secret shouldn't probably be in the cluster name, and the cluster claim should be in the cluster itself. The cluster claim is probably not something that will be exposed to the SMO, right? The SMO creates the cluster claim, maybe it's exposed in a way that it can take actions against it. But if SMO or FOCOM needs to know the actual state of anything, it should go through the inventory. And that's where the cluster CR below is what would be the inventory. And so I would rather want FOCOM to go get anything they need from IMS through the inventory rather than through cluster claim, because we started discussing in the IMS team, right, about the IM model, and it's not clear yet, at least to me, where cluster template has a place in there. Although there will be a place for a cluster in the inventory. So I want to make sure. And so to Tim's point, querying the cluster claim ready status can't be a good indicator to FOCOM that the cluster is good, because all of the underlying components might not be. Whereas if FOCOM cares whether or not the cluster is healthy, goes query the cluster, not the claim that creates the cluster. I'll stop here. I just want to make sure we need to delineate the need of the inventory component, that is the bottom CR, versus the initial intent, that is the cluster claim.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Now, if that claim is truly an intent, then you're going to have to give me the performance indicators, right, by which that the conditions would be resolved, right, in the claim. So if it's saying that you consider a claim to be ready, when all the resources have been assigned, right? Whether regardless of their operational state, that's fine. But that needs to be part of that claim, right? So that way you can say declaratively what you consider something to be ready, right? The KPIs for that. And I don't know if we want to get into that in this piece of it.
Well,
I
could go.
Yeah.
If I'll just add one thing, we could go one level deeper. There is that pattern in Kubernetes where that claim can have in its status field a reference to all the objects it created.
Yes.
So if Fulcom just want to discover them, it could query the claim for give me all the objects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I was saying is allocation or assign. I assigned cluster one. Let me finish. I assigned cluster one, and the claim returns that says here's your cluster, right? Cluster one. If you want to know if it's operational, go ask the cluster, my friend. But here's your claim.
Exactly.
So my thinking was actually that it would be the role of the OTIMS operator here to fetch the relevant information. If it is just from one of the underlying like custom resources or inventory objects or several, then and then actually not update this condition. Then I mean. With completely true ready. It could be some other transitions you could, report, right? But the final one, when you are completely ready, I was thinking that should not be there until you actually, from the IMS side, has considered that, all the underlying like resources that has been triggered that should be reconciled, that all of them has been reconciled and reporting successful.
Well, so you said and in there, right? So again, so we have to ask ourselves is what is the purpose of the create of the cluster, right? And that's what the claim is supposed to be indicative of, right? Is it just creating the necessary underlying resources and assigning them to that claim, right? In this case, assigning the cluster to the claim, right? So that it is assigned allocated resource. It's all gone. The nodes and everything else are done. The pods are all assigned up to that cluster claim, right? And so the question is what do we also then consider the health of that claim to be also the health of the underlying resource, or the fulfillment of that claim to also consider the health of the underlying resource? That was the and that you put there, and that's where I was like going, I don't know. It's kind of like that. My initial expectation would be, here are the resources I assigned, right now, because it also says that day 2 monitoring says if my cluster then is no longer healthy, do I then say that the claim is no longer ready? See what I'm saying, Stefan? I'm just worried about day 2 operation of this stuff, right? And that's what we thought you had said. Okay. So the question is it just assigned, or is it also monitoring the health, right?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, a node at any time later on, a node can go down. I will still see the cluster claim as done. That would be like an inventory notification then that okay, you have a problem in this one. Okay, because I did not mean that this should be like meant for like continuous monitoring. This was just to report the status of the deployment request, and when the Fulcom side can consider that, okay, now I can go ahead and basically we have this cluster registration that I see needs to be like triggered once Fulcom has got an okay from the IMS side, who can pull that, okay, this is now this deployment request has been completed. Now I can at that point in time, I say there should be like this secret should be available then. Like I can understand that we have the ref in another resource, but at least it should be available. It should be possible for Fulcom then to start authenticating and connecting towards that workload cluster. I just wondered about when we say health checks, then if you say that the IMS is not guaranteeing the health, what should
Oh, no, I never,
okay, no.
I never said that. I said,
Yeah.
I said the cluster itself, the cluster kind, right, is the thing that has the health of the cluster, right? It says whether, if any of my resources, the underlying resources I've allocated, if I don't consider myself healthy because if they're not healthy, right, then I need to take care of that as a cluster, right? And I would assume the O2IMS operator would have to deal with that, right? But it's what I was doing is separating the health of the underlying resources that I've created and allocated to that cluster claim, right? Which makes up the cluster, from the actual statement of the claim, right? Because I've allocated the resources, they just don't work, right? Or if I assign the resources to that cluster, they just don't work at this point. So my cluster is not healthy. That's two different things, right?
From a FOCOM point of view, then we could still monitor the cluster claim, but then once that one is true, at that point in time, there should then be a corresponding. We say we have the same API version then, a corresponding pre-OTIMS or OTIMS, we say then, cluster resource as well then. And then FOCOM should rather query that cluster resource then to say,
yeah. And that's why you're returning the assigned resources, right, from that claim. And then you say, okay, let's go. As FOCOM, I would say, hey, FOCOM, if before I want to deploy to it, I better make sure that cluster, because I'm going to have to do that day 2, right? Day 3, day 54, I'm going to have to go before I deploy to that cluster. I want to make sure it's healthy.
Yeah, and if I may chime in for a second, the cluster claim will report when the subsequent objects are created, right? And then FOCOM will be able to register notification for them at that point in time, right? Whether or not they're successfully created, it doesn't matter. FOCOM will be able to register notifications. So whenever there's a state change happening in any of the resource that FOCOM registered to, it will know. And so FOCOM could absolutely go and register against the created sub resources that is the cluster itself in the inventory to know whenever it's healthy, right? So yeah, I think there is a big operation consideration to maybe formalize a bit more here. But I believe, yeah, it really depends how we want that operation to look like. And yeah, there are various ways we could achieve this. Now it depends because we don't have, for instance, the subscribe notifying kind of pattern in Nefio. We won't have it, I think, this release, and we haven't talked about it yet. So I don't think we want to rely on this in the Nefio implementation, at least for the coming release. So I would be in the opinion that we rely rather on cluster claim being able to report all the resources created, and then FOCOM querying these resources based on what it needs to know. And these resources being owned by ultimately the IMS inventory. Of course, inventory is, again, not something in R3, but we're going to assume inventory is going to be etcd for the short term that R3 looks like.
Yeah, and everything I know up in ORAN, particularly like some of the flows that they're doing in SMO and FOCOM, that is the way that they're leaning toward. Lexus. Does that make sense, Stefan?
So the challenge is that you say, we talked about that before also, right? We wanted to make the OTIMS inventory part of like a phase 2 implementation, or at least like the discovery phase here then with FOCOM discovering the OTIMS inventory resources. But what we say now, it kind of makes it almost required to have it already from the beginning, then, or how?
No. When you're on the return of that GET or notification, if it's asynchronous, right? on the return of that get from the cluster claim, every time that it updates resources for that claim, right? I add a new cluster or whatever, right? All the time I do that, I can send you the FOCOM can say, hey, give me an update whenever you get a status update, right? You can send a notification down. You can do that without ever having inventory, right? You can do that just off the cluster. So here I would have a get/cluster, right? And you give it a cluster name.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to put on the side, sorry for jumping, but ORAN for a second. Kubernetes in its API has a watch function.
Yeah.
So you could watch cluster claim when you create it. I understand this is nowhere to be found in ORAN spec, but for the short term, it could get us.
We can do that, yeah.
And that way we don't need to rely on anything else but this. And then as the spec mature or as we mature our implementation in Nefio, we can move along and add more functionality and move away from that watch if we believe we should. Right? But I'm suggesting this as well because it would mean we will have to implement the watch in the IMS operator for FOCOM to being able to leverage it. But I see this as the less intrusive way to implement without creating too much requirement on the side.
Yeah, we have discussed that ourselves also to use that watch approach. But what you said was that then you have a watch on the cluster claim, but then there can be the underlying resources and like the cluster CR coming up and being referred. Should we consider that also, Norden, so that FOCOM needs to start to watch for those additional CRs that are triggered by the same workload cluster?
I would say yes, and the workflow could be FOCOM creates the claim, watch for the claim. Eventually, the claim in its status get the cluster CR. Then FOCOM stop watching the claim and start watching the cluster itself. And then until the cluster is healthy, FOCOM watch the cluster for updates. If the cluster doesn't get healthy until whatever time frame, then something happens. But I would try to keep it. I don't know if it's as easy as I think it is, but in my brain, it's less dependent on external things for the time being. But so it's a little bit of a identifying what would be that process FOCOM would follow. Creating the claim, watching the claim, get the updates that the objects exist, and then start watching the object and stop watching the claim, and so on and so forth, right? So, but this has an implication on how we implement the IMS
exactly.
in Nefio.
Yeah, so we need to agree on that then,
Yeah, exactly. So if that's the path forward, I'm all in, honestly, because that's the most Kubernetes. That's the best Kubernetes ways to implement it, if you ask me. But yeah, it's all of us to agree.
I realize now we are running out of time. 1 hour goes very fast. So what I have added also now then, so these were the slides I've done for the IMS side. So basically we have covered that now. That is very good. Thanks for all that input. So what I have then is like 3 alternatives for how the FOCOM side should be done then in order to integrate towards this interface and also do all the things we said now then about like triggering the watchers and monitoring the status of the cluster claim and so on. I have an alternative just using the standard GitOps engine. I have still the copy alternative that with the copy provider plugin. I have also thought about, or we have discussed then, even slimline this. So instead of having the whole copy framework there, just having a very dedicated FOCOM to IMS operator then. So similar to you have an IMS operator in the IMS side, you have an IMS operator on the FOCOM side doing all this work for you then for the client side part. We will probably need to wait until next week to go through these 3. But I guess perhaps if you can read through them and come with offline comments, or what do you think?
Yeah, my preference is, so we're running into Yes. So let's do this, guys. So we're going to talk about the FOCOM side next Wednesday. If people can review this and provide their comments prior to it, that way, prior to next Wednesday, that way we can get a start on it in any resolution.
Yeah.
Now remember, Friday and Monday, it's Easter weekend, right? So
exactly. Yeah.
But if you're able to do it, we are encouraged to do it. The links are all in the all in the agenda page or on the wiki, so you can see where the design documents there. But that's it. Yeah, we'll start again next week. So it's 11 o'clock. We'll stop it here. Does anyone have anything before we leave? All right.
Do we have the? Sorry, I was trying to find that deck. I want to make sure it's I can find it.
Yeah, it's both on the agenda and also in the user stories folder.
I put both the presentation there and everything is in the Word document as well.
Just look at the agenda. It's got a link to it.
I'm looking. Okay, I'll figure it out. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
You want me to put the link here in the chat for you?
No, I opened the presentation, but I can't find the slides in that presentation.
These slides that he was talking about?
No, I'm seeing them now. It's okay. I have them. Sorry.
Okay,
never mind.
Right. I was like going over it. All right.
No,
thanks,
my
guys.
bad. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll see you guys next Wednesday. Have a happy Easter all.
Yeah, you too. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Stefan. And Stefan, quick question for you. Are you presenting this to the O2IMS team this afternoon? Is that what you said?
No, that is not the case.
Okay.
Okay,
good.
No, we do this internally first in FU, I think.
Okay, great.
We start here
thank you.
Before we do anything in ORAN. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, I misunderstood because exactly I can't be there this afternoon then. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.